Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brad. I am one of the pastors here as well. Hey, we use like an auto scheduler that fills in who does various service roles outside of teaching. And this week it just chose all dudes, and so I'm sorry for that. What a motley crew. We'll try and get something better next week. But thankful for you guys, even though I just threw you under the bus. We are working our way through the book of John here at River City. We've been kind of in somewhat introductory material over the last couple weeks. This kind of opening poem from chapter 1, and then seeing the forerunner of Jesus in John the Baptist. And this week we step now into the section of this book that is going to talk about several different, depending on how you count them, 7 different miracles and signs and things that Jesus said about himself. And so I'm really excited for this section. This is a section where we're going to see a lot of familiar stories, but in each and every one of these, what John is trying to communicate to us is something about Jesus and the kingdom that he was bringing in. Something about who this man was, who John so desperately wants you to follow and to align your life with, who he wants you to come into a relationship with, and he's going to try and tell you about something about him and what it means to walk with him in his kingdom. I don't know how you guys celebrated the past couple weeks, but for us it was tons and tons of treats that we only make one a year. For me, I like to think of the Christmas season as this is the time where we make things that we do not have the self-control for the rest of the year, right? And so one of those things for me is Chex Mix. I do not make this outside of this season. And some of you are like, Chex Mix, you can get that in a bag. You don't know Chex Mix, first of all, because that's trash, right? I have a Google spreadsheet where I literally feed in the amount of the things I want, and it spits out at me the perfect recipe. Well, the secret, the best Chex Mix is made with Crispex, not Chex. Not enough of you are taking notes. It's going to be a long Sunday. But one of the things that happened this year is my daughter, Lucy. She made these lemon and grapefruit bars, and they were phenomenal. They were so good. Everywhere we brought them, people raved over them, and it was a huge tray of them, and so we had to bring them to 3 or 4 events, and I think there's 2 or 3 left in the fridge that I will take care of in the next day or two as we head back into real life where we don't get lemon and grapefruit bars. But I was thinking, how kind of amazing it was. She made these at first for a Christmas gathering that we were going to a little over a week ago, where it was one of those family gatherings where they're bring something, and then it's 3 hours before, and you're like, shoot, I'm tired. I barely want to go to this, and I have to bring something. And I was like, Lucy, would you want to make the treat for this? And she did, and it was kind of amazing because she just did it. She pulled up a recipe, we made sure what we had, and she baked this whole thing. And I was thinking about what it meant for Lucy to learn to bake like this over the past couple years. Because teaching a child to bake is a really interesting thing, right? Because it all starts as just a giant lie, right? You're like, hey, do you want to come cook with me? And you hand this 2-year-old an empty bowl and a spoon, and they're like, ah! You're like, good job, you're making food. And you're like, you're just glad you're not messing with the food I'm actually making, right? And then it grows, and there comes this time, and this is probably my favorite zone of teaching a child to cook, where they are kind of doing it, and you are trying to sneakily fix it, right? They are scooping a cup of salt, and you are casually switching it for sugar, and they don't quite know what they're doing, and you're kind of behind the scenes just covering up all their little mistakes, and then this cake comes out of the oven, they're like, I made a cake! And you're like, you did, honey, right? And you don't ever correct them in that phase, right? You let them live in that moment of this thing that they think they've just produced, but really you've been there all along, making sure that it went as planned. In chapter 2 of the book of John, we see Jesus go to what was a really normal thing, but a really big deal in his culture. He attends this wedding feast. I'll review for you just the first couple verses in John chapter 2, 1 through 5. It'll be on the screen, or feel free to follow along if you have a Bible or a phone with you. It says this. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, they don't have any wine. Has this concern of yours to do with me, woman? Jesus asked. My hour has not yet come. Do whatever he tells you, his mother told the servants. We see Jesus invited to this wedding gathering. Often in the book of John and the other Gospels, you will see Jesus at social events, right? This is something that I think you need to wrap your mind around for a minute. Jesus wasn't always off on his own. He wasn't always just with his disciples. He was often at dinners and parties and weddings. He was the kind of guy that you wanted to be around and you wanted at your stuff. I think Jesus was a fun person. I think he made the things that he was at better. And so Jesus was invited to this wedding feast that we hear here was in Cana of Galilee. Now, there's a little bit of debate over where the exact location of this Cana is, or sometimes it's actually spelled with a Q, like Cana. There's a few archaeological sites. There's one major one in Jerusalem where tourists flock to, but there's a couple people that think there's a cave nearby that might be the actual site of Cana. No matter what's the case, what's important that you realize for this passage, though, is that this Cana was near, probably within 4 to 5 miles of Jesus' hometown of Galilee. Now, why is that important? That's important because the wedding situation that we're looking at is likely Jesus and his mom and his families and then his disciples were even invited in to what was likely the wedding of a close family friend or even a cousin or a relative. This was a big family event. Jesus likely knew almost everyone there. This was a whole hometown gathering. And this passage introduces to us very quickly that at this gathering, a problem arises. They run out of wine, okay? Now, we have to stop for a minute and kind of got to get out of our Western mindset about weddings for a little bit, okay? As opposed to Western culture where weddings are usually a one-day event where, in particular now with the cost of things, you invite only who you have to, right? And you probably fight with your new in-laws about who's coming to this thing, right? You're there's no way we need to feed him dry chicken because it costs $17 and we don't even like him, right? You disagree about this, you're not sure who to invite there, and it's this one-day occasion. The wedding feast or festival, as it was even referred to in this time period and this place, was a multi-day, up to a week-long event that was constantly expanding in who was invited into it. This was not something that you debated over who you were going to invite. You invited everyone you could because this moment of this woman being wed to this man was your glory as a family. It was everything to you. There are cultures that still look a lot like this within the United States, from different immigrant populations to in particular around the world, especially in some Southeastern Asian cultures. Large community-wide event type weddings are still very much a thing. They magnified so much what this union was, and they used this as a celebration to display the prosperity and blessing that had been given to them as a way of declaring and hoping that prosperity would continue for the bride and groom. It was a way that the entire community was bound together. It was a way that the family unit was strengthened. This was a huge, huge deal, a community affair of both provision and celebration. As this week-long celebration went about, you might wonder who was paying for this. It was actually generally the groom who traditionally paid for this in the ancient Near East. While there were some systems of dowry for the female stepping into this family, the responsibility to provide for this feast and to show this level of provision and hospitality and glory laid at the feet of the groom. And this was a responsibility. If you think you are burdened with what a wedding is supposed to be, you've got nothing on this groom, okay? Right? Here's how far it went. If this celebration didn't come up to snuff, this situation, running out of food or drink at this wedding celebration, could actually open the groom to a lawsuit. Like he could be sued and have to return some of the provision being provided to him at this marriage union or the piece of land or cattle or whatever it might be in this agrarian society that was transferring to establish this new family because of his failure to properly honor and show the glory of their family at this occasion. So this wasn't just like, oh no, we're out of Boone's Farm, okay? This was like, oh no, my entire reputation is on the line. And so Mary, the mother of Jesus, upon hearing that the bridal party had run out of wine to serve, that the groom had run out of this wine, comes to Jesus and she presents him with the problem. She says, and you can maybe, after we've just described the importance of this, you can hear it in her hushed voice. She says to Jesus, they've run out of wine. What she's really saying to Jesus is our close friend, our neighbor, perhaps even our cousin, their honor is at stake. They are about to feel some of the deepest and most lasting shame that our society, for all its ills and gains, has to offer. And so she presents this to Jesus. Now, why is she bringing this to Jesus? Well, one, perhaps because it was a family and community affair. Some commentators even believe that Mary may have had like a responsibility in helping to provide for this wedding, that as a member of the community or the family, often they would band together to provide the food and to make sure that the wedding feast, as it went on for day and day after, was provided for. So maybe she had some responsibility in it. Maybe she just cared and had a tender heart towards the situation. But she brings it to Jesus, likely because at this point she had come to really rely on her son. I pulled my wife and my daughter aside this week and I was like, guys, this is really cool. I think I learned potentially a new thing about Jesus this week that I really hadn't ever processed. And I don't know if I've just skimmed over this before, but many people and scholars believe that potentially by this time that Jesus is about to perform this first miracle, that Jesus had already lost his father. The last mention of Jesus that we see in Scripture, or of Joseph, Jesus' earthly father that we see in Scripture, is when he's 12 years old at the temple. It was very common in this time for the age difference between men and women to be pretty vast. And so while Mary was likely around somewhere between 14 and 16 when she was wed to Joseph and gave birth to Jesus, Joseph could have been much older. And now Jesus, in his prime of late 20s, early 30s, even perhaps, depending on how you date Jesus' life, could have very well lost his dad already, leaving Mary a widow. Potentially, Mary had already come to depend on Jesus to take care of her day in and day out, potentially even for her livelihood. As Jesus realized this, Jesus manually labored as a carpenter to help provide for his family throughout his life until his public ministry. So it's not really that surprising that Mary would come to Jesus and say, son, I need you to help me solve this problem. Now, we're not sure what Mary expected in this moment, right? I don't know if she was just asking him to run to 7-Eleven. I don't know if she was expecting him to help cover up this shame in some way. Some people do believe that she expected a miracle. The response of Jesus does somewhat lend to thinking that he knew that Mary was asking for something spectacular to happen. It's unclear how much Jesus did miraculous things in his upbringing before this moment. The authors of the Gospels are clear that this was the first public miracle of Jesus. Whether or not Jesus did some fancy stuff before then, we don't know. There's some apocryphal stories of Jesus doing some things. Well, we can't really lend any credence to them because there's no kind of cross-referencing establishment for what Jesus did as a young boy. But certainly he showed some aptitude, and I have to imagine that Mary, as his mom, knew something was up. I mean, an angel told her, right? Like if you were wondering, Mary, did you know? Yeah, she knew a lot of it, okay? I'm trying to solve that song. You just stop singing it because it's a little, I don't like it. So Mary probably knew that Jesus had something to do here, and so she asks Jesus, or she presents the problem to Jesus, and Jesus gives this response that maybe when you hear it, and I know I've read it this way several times, I'm like, man, what is Jesus' tone in this response, right? When he says, what has this concern of yours to do with me, woman? And this phrasing here is a little difficult. Some people think it could be translated more accurately like, what does this have to do with you and I? Or what is this concern that you would bring it to me? And then he answers, and this is maybe where it gets the most terse. He puts that word woman on the end of it, which you're like, that's not what we say, right? We don't be like, woman? Like, no. Like, I feel uncomfortable now. Somebody's going to clip that, right? Like, right? This is probably more akin to ma'am. Some translations try and translate it as dear woman. That's probably a stretch. Like, it wasn't like a warmth term. This was more cold and formal, but it wasn't insulting like you might think of referring to a woman as woman. It was probably more like ma'am. So what does this have to do with me, man? Some respect, but some like, don't bring me into this right now. And Jesus quickly says why he has this concern when he answers, my hour has not yet come. I love Mary's response because it's such a mom, right? Like, Jesus is like, what does this have to do with me, Mom? And she goes, do whatever he tells you. Which to me just has this calm confidence of like, I know he's going to help. Why is Jesus asking this question? Why is Jesus saying this? My hour has not yet come. It seems that Jesus may know that Mary is requesting something miraculous. And what we're really seeing here is Jesus using a phrase that he's going to use time and time again. Now, as the reader of this book, assume for a moment this is the first time you're reading the Gospel of John. You would have no idea why he's saying that, okay? Like, you have no idea. What does he mean, my hour has not come? Because you're not going to know what his hour is. Perhaps you, for the first time, are learning about the life and the works of Jesus in this moment. You hear that phrase, and you're like, what hour is coming in his life? If you are a reader, though, who's read these books, or you know the story of Jesus, or if you're John recording this, you know that this is something Jesus will say time and time again, referring to the lead up to his ultimate death. So Jesus uses this phrase as a way of foreshadowing what is to come. That the onset of his public ministry will ultimately lead to his crucifixion and death. He knows that the start of his public ministry is a life-changing thing. I do not believe that Jesus is rushed into his public ministry in this moment. He just would have not done it, right? If this wasn't God's timing for the ministry of Jesus to start, he wouldn't have been forced into it by the request of his mother. Certainly, this was the destined time for Jesus' first public miracle to happen. But when he asked his mother this, he's saying, hey, it's not quite time for me to be outwardly public with these miracles because that's going to lead to my ultimate death. But as we see and we continue in verse 6, Jesus does take action, although a little bit more in private and quiet. Verse 6 says this through verse 10. Now 6 stone water jars had been setting there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. Fill the jars with water, Jesus told them, and so they filled them to the brim. Then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter, and they did. When the head waiter tasted the water after it had become wine, he didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. He called to the groom and he told him, everyone sets out the first wine first, and then after the people are drunk, the inferior. But you've kept the fine wine until now. Now, Jesus' first miracle is spectacular. And I want you just to picture it for a moment, right? Jesus steps likely into like a musty back room or like behind a tent where this gathering is happening. And he calls who to him? Does he call the head waiter? No. Does he call the bride and the groom? No. Does he call people of status or great social worth to him or wealth? No, he calls the servants in. He calls the servants around, and they're the only ones who will actually truly, other than the disciples who it appears were present, witness this miracle. Seems like Mary drops off into the distance. Jesus, his disciples, and the servants are there, and he gives them this instruction. He says, go fill these basins that we have. So they're these large stone basins of water that were there for people to wash as they came in. So water would be drawn out of these basins with a ladle. People would be allowed to wash before they entered this for purification as they entered this ceremonial place and for just actual cleanliness. He says, take those jars, those 6 large, like, do you know, so I got chickens, not to brag, and so I have like a 5-gallon water pail and like when I have to give those chickens water, I hate it because that thing is heavy. Like 5 gallons of water in a plastic pail is a pain in the butt to carry across the yard to your chicken coop. A lot of you are glazing over right now. You don't care at all. That's a lot of water. That's a 20 to 30 gallon stone vessel. Like, I don't even know how they moved these things, right? These are huge. Jesus says, fill those up to the brim. And there's no recording here of exactly what Jesus does, like how he transforms in this moment, but something happens. Jesus has them fill them to the brim, and he says to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter. And I imagine these servants are like, what? That's pretty gross, right? Like, this is our foot washing tank, okay? Like, I'm not going to do that, right? Like, this is probably not going to go well for you if you go to, like, the head waiter, like, picture, like, you're Downton Abbey butler. I think this guy's pretty buttoned up, okay? And you're like, I have this thing for you to drink, and you know it's foot water. And he's stressed because they're out of wine. He's like, this is about to go down. Like, we're going to have some angry folks, right? They did it. And they bring this water to the head waiter after it had become wine, John reminds us. The head waiter takes a sip, and then you know what he does? He does a bit, okay? If you're confused why he says this, if you're struggling with like, what do you mean? Jesus is getting everybody drunk. I don't think that's what the text is trying to say. I think the waiter tells a joke, okay? If you think about this ancient Near Eastern wedding, and you think about the positioning of the bride and groom would be like dead center on presentation for everyone to see, okay? So to go to even speak to the groom or to call out to the groom would be to like halt the whole gathering that is literally happening before them and around them. Most cultures, when they think about like the bride and the bridegroom, like they place them in a place where it's like they are almost royalty for that day, and everyone can see them. We practice a little bit of this in our culture with like this idea of the head table, but this was much more than this. I was at a wedding for a family member recently who's from a different culture, and they literally rent chairs that are like thrones for the bride and groom to sit in. And they are danced around and chanted around. Money is like literally thrown at them. They are celebrated for what feels like, I'm going to be honest as a white guy, way too much time, okay? It was like, it's been like 25 minutes. Like what? We would have had dinner served by now at a white wedding, okay? Their culture is way better. I'm going to be honest. Like there was something about the way that I thought about what a wedding was after I attended that wedding that changed me forever. Because it was so much more important. It carried so much weight. It was so much honor and responsibility and family and community in a way that just hasn't been expressed in many of the weddings from my culture that I've been to. To speak to the groom in this moment and to call out to him was an obviously public moment. And so what I think the head waiter does is he kind of tells a joke because he's just so taken aback. Because he takes a sip of this wine and indulge me for a moment. If you are not a lover of wine, it's real good, okay? Like, I'm on like a T. Joe's $10 bottle budget, okay? The other night, literally had a date night, and I invested in a $30 bottle of wine. It was so good, right? It was so good. I like literally, I said to Sarah, I was like, it is amazing how good a $30 bottle of wine is, right? When you drink $8 bottles of wine normally. Like, this is really, really good. This moment must have been amazing, right? Like, this is a culture without even some of the same, like, modern techniques. This is a culture where, like bacteria could much more easily get into your fermentation if you weren't careful. Often wine was thinned with water just to extend the production of it. A lot of viticulture surrounded, yes, like, the safety of drinking water, and so, like, providing something that was potable and could be transported across different places and different times. And so in this moment, Jesus prepares for them the best wine that this guy who's been running weddings likely for years has ever tasted. So much so that he calls out to the whole assembly. And I just like to picture him like almost giddily being like, oh my gosh. Like, do you know what most people do? Most people 3 days in are scraping the bottom of the literal barrel, pun intended, of the cheapest junk. But do you know what this guy's done? Like, do you know how prosperous this groom is? This groom has brought out the best wine I have ever tasted in my entire life. And can't you just see that place just like going nuts for that bridal party, right? Just like, what? Like they're bringing out the best wine ever? How much of it, guys? 6 stone vats of 20 to 30 gallons. That's 120 to 180 gallons of wine. That's 600 to 900 bottles of wine, okay? This is what Jesus rolls out of the best wine that I think anyone's ever tasted. So the head waiter tells a joke and leaves me for my entire life to anticipate the marriage feast of the Lamb where we might sip from this cup with the Lord. Like, it's just this little snippet, right? Of how good the goodness of Jesus can be in a tangible thing that we can imagine. Because, friends, like, the goodness of Christ will be so much greater than anything you could taste, anything you could see or hear. The goodness of Christ will fill our very bones, will alleviate our every hurt, will wipe away our every tear. How amazing must have this moment have been to taste a sip of that goodness in just a moment. So what happens? The bridal party is greatly honored. They get all the glory. From running out of wine in one moment, facing lawsuit and shame, to serving the finest wine that has ever been served days into a wedding feast. We read about the aftermath of this in verse 11 and 12. It says this: Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. How does John surmise what just happened in this moment? He says, Jesus, in that moment, revealed his glory. Now, this seems to allude to me to what will happen later in the story of Jesus' life on earth when he undergoes what we know as the transfiguration. In that moment where Jesus displays for a select few of his disciples on a mountaintop, he displays a physical manifestation of his glory. Now, this looked nothing like that, right? Like this was in a dark, sectioned off area. No one even really saw what happened but a few disciples to record it and the servants. It wasn't bright, it wasn't loud, it was in secret. Jesus doesn't even publicly take the responsibility or receive any of the glory for this miracle. So why does John record it in this way? Like, why does John say in this moment Jesus showed his glory when it wasn't bright, when it wasn't anything like what we think the glory of God would look like? Well, I think he says this because when the disciples did or saw what he did, this is recorded as a moment for them of deep belief. That seeing Jesus behave in this way, seeing this miracle take place, seeing the outcome of Jesus' actions fundamentally changed the disciples' opinion of Jesus from being a great teacher, a rabbi who they might follow, to being God himself in some way, shape, or form. Perhaps not yet fully for the disciples did they understand that this was God, but fundamentally their display of him changed and they saw a piece of his glory. What did they see, though? I think what they saw was that the power of Jesus took the shame of a man and woman and through a miracle handed it back to them in abundant glory. This is why the text makes the point and almost absurdity of the quality and the spectacle and the scope of this miracle. Hundreds and hundreds of bottles of the finest wine that anyone could ever taste. Just invite you for a moment. So I'm going to ask you, like everybody just look at me for a minute. Like, stop taking notes, stop doing whatever you're doing. If you're a fiddler, stop fiddling, okay? And just close your eyes, okay? We don't do weird stuff like this very often, so bear with me. Just close your eyes. Now, I'm not going to make you say this out loud or do something freaky, but I just want you to think of, like, what in your life makes you feel shame? really go just a little deeper than the normal in your introspection and think like, what is it about me that I believe if the world saw this, it would ruin me? That I would be exposed, never forgiven, canceled from all things. As you pause for a moment, thinking of the shame, thinking of the depth of how it condemns you, how it makes you feel unworthy, the fear that maybe it arises in you, imagine for this moment that Jesus offers you this same kind of miracle in your life. That the same Jesus who changed water to wine, who took the shame of a groom who stood to lose his bride and all of his possessions in a lawsuit because of his failure to provide, whether that was because of poor planning, because of negligence, or because of just a mistake, who took his shame and replaced it with glory that he was never due. Open your eyes for a moment now and realize that what Jesus offers you in his kingdom is that your shame, which you could never recover from, that your guilt, that your debt, that thing that you wish no one would ever know, that he doesn't just take it away, that he replaces it with glory. That he invites you in to share in his miraculous existence. And friends, this glory, this feast, this party, this honor that Jesus wishes to lavish on you just from following and believing in him is a miraculous, ever-expanding thing. Listen to how Isaiah, in Isaiah 25:6, describes the glory that is the kingdom of the Lord coming when it says this: "On the mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples. A banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheets that cover all nations." The Jesus that changes water into wine, the Jesus that replaces one man's shame for inexplicable, undeserved glory, is the God who wishes to invite the entire world, an ever-expanding people from all backgrounds, to remove the veil from their eyes and to invite them into a feast, into a glory, into a party like they have never, ever known. So I'm going to pray, and in this prayer I'm going to ask you just to contend for a moment if you think the glory of God is great enough to overcome your shame. If you will trust in a Jesus who not only forgives your sins because of his payment on their account, but who invites you into his resurrection and the marriage feast of the Lamb. And then we're going to approach the table and we're going to celebrate communion together. And in particular today, as you take this bread and this juice and wine in your hand and you partake in it, would you just imagine for a moment the glory that will come when Jesus is fully revealed before us all, and we dine with him in the kingdom, fully beholding the glory that he offered to us. Let's pray together. Lord, my shame is so deep. Lord, I don't know why there wasn't enough wine at this wedding. I don't know whose fault it was. But Lord, if it was me, there would have been 100 reasons why I could have screwed that up. And Lord, there are, for each of us here, so many ways that we can write a list of why we shouldn't be offered any honor or glory. Maybe our pride chief among them. And yet, Lord, you have invited us to the table. Lord, you have lifted up a cup before our friends, our family, and our enemies and said, look at the provision that I have invited you into. And so, Lord, whether for the first time or the 100th time, Lord, we accept that invitation. Lord, to exchange our shame for your glory. Lord, knowing that your glory did not stay hidden, that, Lord, the disciples and the servants saw it in that moment. And Lord, in your resurrections, hundreds and thousands more. And then, Lord, in the establishment of your bride and the proclamation of the gospel, your glory shines all over the world. Though dim sometimes in these seasons of darkness in which we walk, ultimately, Lord, to be magnified and culminated in a feast, in a wedding, where you preside as the bridegroom, Lord. Because your provision and your glory never runs out and is unrivaled. So much so that our shame fades into the nothingness as we are invited to share in your glory. Save us, O Lord. Forgive us of our sin. And let us walk with you in the honor and the glory that only you can bring. Amen.